Hello, welcome back. It's Pauline from PQW and we're in our third lesson in the series of busting our stash to create a vest, and we've been working on a lovely little child's vest. So we're up to now getting ready to stitch. So I'm going to do a little bit of quilting on this section here just to hold the weaving down in place because it's for a child. You know, we know you need things to be a little bit robust with them playing and the amount of times that it'll be washed. But I have started doing some quilting, but I just want to talk to you about drawing some lines so that you can sew a nice straight line, how we're going to set the machine up to quilt through these lines. And then after we do that, we're going to go back to our work table and we're going to trim this back. We're going to then make a lining and talk about putting a binding around the edge. So, and it's all finished. So it's a very, very simple step in this lesson that you need to take. And you can do any sort of quilting you want. When we go back to the work table, I'll show you some quilting I've done on the other vest so that it gives you a little bit of an idea of different aspects that you can add to make it more creative. But I'm just going to use my ruler and I'm going to use the bowhin marking pencil, the one I always recommend, because I know when I mark the lines I need them to come out when I wash the vest. But what we're going to do, because we've got these consistent width strips that we've put on that we're going to weave, what I've done is I've just drawn from point to point on those strips, and that's going to give me like a grid. Just get the right colour pencil. So just by lining your ruler up, lining up point to point, and then drawing your line across, and just press as hard as you need to be able to see that line. You don't want it too dark. If you're using dark fabrics, you'd obviously use the pencil with the white lead, but I'm using the dark lead. So just keep drawing and keep going through. And you go, I've done it both ways because I just really want to do a fair bit of quilting on this because I know the little girl I've made it for, she's rough and tough. It'll be washed a lot, so it'll just anchoring down those strips make it a lot more durable for the parents. So now I'm going to go to the machine and I'm going to stitch all of those lines one way, and then I'm going to come back and stitch the other way. But as I said, I've got a fair bit of the quilting done on this. So when we look at the other side, here's our t-shirt that we cut up. Here's the quilting that I've done. It sits beautifully. You don't have to worry about it moving too much, particularly if you glue those edges nicely like we talked about in lesson 2. And you can see I've got the overhangs that I can trim off later on. So now to the machine. Let's talk about what we need on the machine to make this job easy so everything sits really neatly for you. I'm using the open toe foot. It's the foot that I use for all of my sewing, the foot that has nothing in the front. I have the sew slip mat on the bed of the machine, which is going to let this bulk move through beautifully. I have got my machine threaded up with the monopoly clear thread in the top and the bobbin. Now I've done that because I didn't have a light coloured pink thread to match the t-shirt, and using all the multicolours on the front of this t-shirt, if I used a pink thread it was going to show up too much on the white. So I just felt the monopoly thread was the perfect thread for me to use to let it blend in with everything that I've got. If you need to know how to use the monopoly thread or any of the tools that I talk about in this lesson, please go to my YouTube channel because there is a lesson there on every one of the tools that we sell, and you can learn how to use it. Now, with our machine, you'll need to increase your stitch length. I'm going to go up to stitch length 3. I just find that works for me because we've got the bulk. Now, if you've done my control quilting lesson or you've watched the YouTube videos on that, because we're sewing through bulk and I'm not using a walking foot, I'm going to release the pressure off the foot so that this machine allows the bulk just to glide through there. So I'm coming down to my icon My machine, the pressure when I put the foot down is set at 75. That's the setting, the amount of pressure that comes onto the fabric. So I'm going to take it down to about 20 and lock it in. I find that works well for me. If you can't release the pressure off the sewing foot, you may have to use a walking foot, but you'll have to try what's right for your machine. So now we're just going to start sewing. It's simple sewing, but there's one little tip as we come along that I'm going to just suggest to you, because as we come across these strips that we've woven, the foot may get caught underneath the strips. So that's why I'm going to be having the awl that I used when I was doing the weaving. I'm going to have this in my hand to eliminate that foot going in underneath those strips that we've woven. So off we go. It's very simple. Now by releasing that pressure, you can see that my fabric's not going to walk forward. If you find that you've got an open toe foot on and you can't release the pressure, or even if you release the pressure and you feel that your fabric's walking ahead of you, release the pressure a bit more or do have your walking foot on. Now when I come down to here, I'm just going to hold the fabric down with the awl. Now particularly when I get here down to the next one, because the foot, the edge of the foot can go straight underneath that piece of woven fabric there. So if I hold that down, it doesn't do that. So just hold it all down. That one you could see there, if I hadn't have held it down, see how it goes underneath there? And then it gets caught up. So just hold it down with the awl. And they're a great tool to have in your hand for any sort of piecing and that you're doing. It really works well. I call it my third hand. So now we're going to go back and I like to quilt all the one way so that it doesn't drag backwards and forwards. We'll do the next line. Have that all in your hand. And it's very simple sewing. Nothing hard about it at all. You know, you could be putting a fancy pattern on here if you choose to, but just anchor it down as much as what you think you need to make it durable for the person that's wearing it. Hold down with the awl. There we go. You just keep quilting away till you get that all done. Now, when it comes to the lines that you've marked, it depends what marking pencil you've used, but with me using the bowhin pencil, if I make a mistake or you see the lines, I can just easily come back and erase that out with the eraser that's on the pencil. I don't even have to wash it when I've finished it. Just erase it out. Oh, there's a line I've missed. Let's go back and do that line. Very easy to miss these lines. Hold down. You know, you might be clever enough to eyeball this straight line across there without drawing it, but I definitely can't do that. Let's get that back in underneath. Okay, so now we've finished that and we're going to go back to the work table. We'll just check the back of it to see that we've got it all quilted. Yes, every line's quilted, it's all even. And see, it sits beautifully, really does. So let's go back to the work table and let's trim this back and talk about your lining, whether you want to line it or not, and show you some options that you have. Right, we're ready now to trim this back. As you can see, we've got all the quilting done. And as you can see on this one, this is the back. I didn't quilt every square because it's got the weaving all the way through. Where our fronts, we've spaced the weaving out because we ran out of fabric. So you've got lots of options. So I've just done every second strip, but it quilts up beautifully. So we're going to now trim. around the edges here, so just with your good sharp scissors, or you could use your rotary cutter if you want, but I just prefer to do this with my scissors. Just trim all the way around. You know, and if it's not straight up the front, once you trim back like this, or as you're trimming it, if you're using your rotary cutter, you may like to have your ruler and put your ruler on there so you get a nice straight edge. You could mark it out with your marking pencil, or you could cut with your rotary cutter. So around your neckline. But you can see how easy it is having that t-shirt as your foundation. But remember, if you're making a jacket, you'd be wearing you'd be using a wind cheater or a sloppy joe, whatever you call it, wherever you come from. So we just keep trimming. But you need really good sharp scissors. That's why I love these jack scissors. I love them because they've got the big space for my bendy fingers to fit through. They're really, really sharp. They're just wonderful to use. So down we go. You don't have a lot of waste. Now this is a little bit crooked here, so I'm just going to trim it so it's nice and even. We left the hem on the t-shirt, that's fine. Just gives it a little bit more stability at the bottom. Now if you didn't want to line this, we could just join the shoulder seams together, the side seams together, and we could then just bind around the outside edge. And you have lots of options. You might like to leave it square at the front, you might like to round it at the front, you might like to round it at the neckline here, which I'm going to do because I just think it sits much nicer. It might come up too high. You could put a little collar on. You could put a tab on the front and put a zipper in it. You could do all sorts of things. But I'm seeing that this front's not level all the way down. So I'm just going to check it here. It's just a little bit off because I want it to be 1.5 inches. It's 1.5 inches up here, 1.5 inches here. So I'm just going to make sure that I trim that off and just get that gone. And now it will be straight. It doesn't matter so much at this edge because that's going to be your side seam. And it does need to flare out a little bit there. Actually, I just need to trim that. My little cutter didn't cut right through. This is where I'd normally use the big rotary cutter, but haven't got it handy. So there we go, all trimmed up, all neat and tidy. So now all we would do is put the right sides together. It's just like constructing any garment. We're not going to go into that in big lengths here. We're just going to put our seams together. Now we have got a fair bit of bulk because we've got all those woven strips with the wadding in them. But this is where I recommend having the good, really sharp flower head pins to pin this and pin this. So we're going to sew the shoulder seams first, like I've already got this one sewn. Now you can come and grade a fair bit of this out if you wish to. This is where once again, the scissors are great. You can trim. I take about a 1/2 inch seam, but it might be advisable that you try it on the person you're making the garment for before you start seaming and trimming everything back. You might like to just pin it and put it on them inside out to make sure that you don't have to take a less or a more seam allowance, because remember we started with this being so much bigger. The t-shirt was so much bigger than what it is now, because with the cutting it apart, cutting all the overlocking off, with doing all the weaving and all the quilting on it, it would have pulled in quite a bit. So you will need to do a refit to make sure it's fitting right. And then we'll take a little bit of this bulk out of the seam. Press the seam opened. Just do a bit more. And then use your glue and glue the seam down. Oops. My glue's a bit runny this morning. Just glue that down. That'll sit it flat. Now, if you didn't want to line this, there's two ways we could work with this. We could leave the seam as it is and just zigzag the seam before we glue it open. We could cut a cover strip of fabric and put over that. You could simply just cut a piece of fabric. You could sew it onto one side. Let's just pull this up where we glued it. You could sew it onto one side before you did all that trimming that I've just done. Trim it and then turn it over. You know, you could do a contrast colour, you could get a light pink, you could do anything. You could machine stitch this in the ditch, or you could hand stitch it down. So you could cover those seams like that. Also with the side seams, we're going to pin those. Now it is important, if you've got your weaving and you want to line it up exactly, make sure when you pin that you've got it lined up. Just do your bit of pinning. Now, when I sew this, I'm still going to use the open toe foot. I'll move my needle position to get my needle into the position that I want it to be, so that I use the edge of the foot to the needle will be my seam allowance. I will have the pressure released off the foot like I did for the quilting, because we're going to be sewing through a lot more bulk now. I might have to adjust it down a little bit further. But that's all we're going to do. We're going to sew the shoulder seams, the side seams. Then we're going to talk about the lining. Now the lining, what we've done here now, we've taken one step, we have to go back a step, but I just wanted to show you the seaming here. But when we're doing the lining, before we start joining it together, obviously we have to cut the lining out. So we have our fabric. This is what I'm going to use for the lining. I have plenty of this fabric, and it's so pretty, isn't it? It's gorgeous. So this will be for the fronts. So I'm just going to fold it in half. Put your piece on it. This is your pattern. And you're just going to cut around that. Same with the back. Before you join anything to the back, you're going to cut your back lining out. Once you cut that out, you're going to make it up like you make up the jacket or the vest. So we've sewn the side seams, we've sewn the shoulder seams. Once we join the two fronts to the back for the outside of the vest, I'm going to show you how to put the lining inside and how to put a binding around the outside edge. It's done, it's finished. Really is so easy to do. So let's go to the machine and do a bit of sewing, and I'll come back and I'm going to show you how to put this lining in, how to cut your bias and to make it, and how to put it around the outside edge. Very, very simple. We're nearly finished the lesson. So let's go to the sewing machine. Right, now we've got this all joined together. We've got our back and our two fronts. So we've constructed our vest. Yay! So you can see here's our seams inside. I've trimmed the back, I've glued them down. But remember, if you could either just zigzag those, overlock them, or put a binding across the edges of them if you want to just leave the t-shirt as a lining, which is just lovely. There's nothing wrong with that, but I just want to go over a lining with you to make it simple. But what we're going to do first is I want to trim curve the edges of the neckline and the bottom. So I'm just going to fold this in so the two fronts are even. Now you could use a cup, a plate, a circle, you could use anything to do this, but I'm just going to eyeball it because I just want a nice little gentle curve. So just to round it off a bit. Okay, just make that a bit more even. And then I'll do the same at the neckline. Like if you're working on an adult's one, you might want to pin it to get it all even. I want to just make sure that's even at the bottom and keep it even. So I'll pop some pins in here, just to keep that nice and nicely positioned there. and then I'll just curve this front area. You don't need to take a lot off to curve that. But you might have a pattern for a nice collar that you could put on this and follow the instructions in the pattern. You might be able to, as I said before, you might be able to put a piece up the front and put a zipper in. There you go. So that, I think that looks better when it's rounded like that, and the back looks gorgeous. Seams have come together nicely. It's nicely quilted. It's nice and warm and cuddly. A little bit stiff at the moment, but once it's washed, it will soften right down. So we've got our lining made. So we're just going to pop this inside. Just pop one inside the other. Just align your shoulder seams so they're aligning up. And yes, I haven't trimmed the neckline or the bottom of the lining yet. I'll do that later on once I get this all pinned. So we're just going to go around and pin this in place. You can see by just pinning this I'll be able to come back and trim that little bit off there. So it's very, very simple. Now we're going to bind the edge just like you'd be binding a quilt, but I'm going to cut the strips of fabric. Because I've rounded the edges now, I need to cut the binding on the bias. If you left it just as a square end, you could cut your fabric on the straight grain. So just remember whichever way you want to go. But to get around these curves, we need to have it on the bias. Now we want to align our seam allowances up, so I'm going to open the seam on this lining and line those up. Oops. So just go all the way around and do that. And once you've got that done, you'll be then ready to do your binding around the outside edge. So now we've got the lining all pinned in, ready to go. Just make sure the seams are all joining up, everything's nice and flat. So the lining is a little bit longer, so I'm going to have to trim that back. But let's do the binding first. As I said, if you've curved those edges, we're going to have to cut on the bias. So let's just do a little quick tip on cutting your fabric on the bias. This is the fabric that I've chosen to use. So I'm going to cut the binding 3 inches wide because I've got a little bit of bulk there. Remember, we've got all that wadding in the weaving strips. I find if I cut it like I cut for a normal binding for around a quilt or for a normal garment, where I'd probably cut it 2.5, it's probably just not going to be wide enough. So I've chosen to do it 3 inches wide. So I'm going to use my bias sasha ruler. Now this is the ruler that I've designed up to cut all of our fabric on the true bias. So we're going to line, and you can watch more about this ruler and all the different things you can do with it on my YouTube channel. So go there and look at the playlist and look up bias sasha ruler. I'll show you lots of other things that you can do with this ruler. So we're going to align so that this line on diagonal line on the ruler is running parallel on one edge of the fabric, and this line going across on the other angle is laying parallel with the edge of the fabric. So now we know that is the true bias. We'll use our little cutter and cut across. So there's our first cut. Oops, missed that first little bit. So now I don't keep using the ruler now and moving it across. I like to fold this edge to this edge. And if you're working on a longer piece, you can fold it as many times as you want. Now that's going to make it easier and a neater cut. So this is our straight edge. This is the bias edge that I've just cut. So I'm going to line one of these lines running on this angle onto that straight edge of the fabric. You can see it running down here. I've come across my 3 inches. 1, 2, 3. Better get it to the 3 inches. You can see the 3-inch mark there. So that's the straight line on the bias edge and the diagonal line on the straight edge. I know that sounds like double Dutch, but that's how you'll cut perfect bias strips. And we just cut across. Once again, next cut, align your diagonal line on your straight edge, your straight line on your bias edge, and cut. And just keep cutting, and then we'll join them like we would join a normal bias, just like so. Now decide what seam allowance you're going to take here to join your bias strips together. I'm going to use a 1/2 inch, so I'm dropping this down from here to here, down 1/2 inch, and you can measure that with your ruler. There's the 1/2 inch mark. I've got 1/2 inch hanging over this edge, and then I'll pop some pins in. And that's exactly where I'm going to seam. So when I seam down along here, let's grab another pin, and I seam that and fold it out, it's going to be perfectly straight. Okay, so whatever you offset on these angles here is exactly the seam allowance you need to take. So join all your strips together. Once you've got them joined together, I'm going to use the 1.5 inch sasher tool, and we're just going to fold the fabric in half and press the first little bit. You've probably seen me do this many times before. Pop it into the tool, up and back down. We'll pin that into the ironing surface. Just haven't got quite straight there. Just hold the top of the fabric, but don't stretch it, because remember this is on the bias. And we're just going to push the tool with the iron. Let's turn this around. Hold the top fabric. Oops, get it back on line. And just push. And keep going through till you get the whole strip done. Now we're ready to bind the edge. You could come and stitch this lining to the jacket first if you wanted to, if you feel that the pins are going to be in the road and it's going to shift and everything. You would need to trim your lining back, which I'll need to do. But just to start, I've got all my binding made up here. I'm just going to come to this side, so we're going to trim that off so we can. I do want to stitch around this first because I just want to hold it in place. Then I'll trim it, and I'm going to put my binding on from the wrong side, from the inside of the vest. Okay, from the inside I'll stitch it on with a 3/8 inch seam. Then I'll roll it over to the front. I'll glue it down with the Roxanne glue basted, and then I'm going to top stitch really close on the edge with the clear monopoly thread, because I just don't have a pink thread to match this. So let's just look at this vest, and you'd finish the start and the finish of your binding off as you would for a quilt. So we can see here I've stitched the binding on from the inside, the lining side. I've folded it over, I glued it down really well with the Roxanne glue basted, and then I've come back and I've stitched right on the very edge, as close as I could. So by moving your needle position over and using the inside edge of the foot here and the needle here, you're going to get a perfect row of stitching. So that's just a few little tips of finishing it off, but you can finish off your garment however you want. Regardless, you know, there's lots and lots and lots of ways that we can finish garments off. I'm not a real dressmaker. This is just the way I've made it up to be. If you're into sewing clothing and garments, you might have a much better suggestion of how to finish it off. But I think putting a lining in makes it a really nice finish. As I said, with the black and white one that I'm working on, I've chosen that I'm not going to put a lining on that. But with these ones here that I've worked on, just a few little Hence, I am, as you can see, I've been doing some quilting on here. So I've been using our quilting templates to put these designs on, and I've used just this shape. And with my fabric marking pen, just grab the right colour pencil, which I haven't got right here, but what I do is I just come through and mark through the splits in the template, and then I've gone and I've quilted on those lines. Just simply using the open toe foot, releasing the pressure off the foot like we've been doing for the sewing, and just quilting. And I'm just going to come through at random and put a few of these little quilting shapes on there just to anchor down that weaving so it doesn't get caught in things like, I can imagine walking past a door handle or something and getting caught with that. Or you could do like we've done with this one. This one here, I've used this leaf template and I've traced this inner part and this part onto the fabric, and then I've quilted on those lines. And I've just dropped some leaves in here and there just to anchor it down. I haven't done any on this side because all I've done is stitched in a quarter of an inch on each side, and on the back, as I said before, I've just stitched that quarter inch on the back of each strip. So there's many ways you could finish these off. There's no rules. You just find a way to make your garment, and they are beautifully soft. They're beautifully cuddly. I can't wait to get this one made because this one's I'm making for myself. So one day soon you'll see me in this, and I think we may come back a bit later on in another lesson. I'll show you how I'm hopefully going to put a collar on this one and a zipper or buttons up the front. So I'll be putting a tab up the front there. So I hope you've learned a lot from us in this class. It's all about busting our stash. Like if you could see my drawers behind me, I'm going to have to make thousands of these. But I'm going to make some, for my grandchildren and for my son and daughter-in-law, some sweatshirts. I'm going to turn them into jackets for them for winter. But yeah, we'd love to see some photos. If you make something using up your stash, we'd love to see you to share some photos with us. So hopefully you've enjoyed it. Get your tools together and enjoy, because I think you will. Have fun weaving. Till we see you next time. Bye for now.